Assalamualaikum and very good day everyone. My name is Suhaila Mohamed. I am from UITM campus Puncak Alam. Today I'm making a presentation for FBM Rembau National E-National Conference 2022. The title of my presentation is Coding Methods for Novice Qualitative Researcher. As an introduction, I would like to draw a difference between quantitative and qualitative research, because most of us here are from the Faculty of Business and Management. We are normally very much familiar with quantitative research, but sometimes the issues at hand requires us to describe or understand or interpret new phenomena which not well researched in the past. So therefore, when we are in that situation, we have no choice but to look into another type of research, which is qualitative research. And therefore, the purpose of this presentation is to illustrate how to perform a coding process, which is essential as a data analysis process in qualitative research. And along the way, I will illustrate in my presentation about two methods of coding. One is causation coding and another one is pattern coding. These two methods of coding are especially important and relevant if the purpose of the research is to look into how human interacted with another human being. I hope at the end of the presentation is to be able to give some illustration to those new in qualitative research, or maybe for someone who are used to quantitative research and cannot imagine how data analysis is conducted in qualitative research. First thing first, we will look into what is the coding process. If we compare qualitative research and quantitative research, so in quantitative research, the data analysis is done by some software. However, in a qualitative research, the researchers themselves have to do the data analysis. The qualitative research may rely on a software, but the usage of software in qualitative research is only to manage massive data, but not for the purpose of analytical tool for data analysis. So therefore, a qualitative researcher rely on coding. Okay, so coding is a process where researcher look at the raw data, and the researcher need to retrieve and categorize similar data so that the researcher can pull out and cluster the segments of data into a particular research question. So the role of the researcher while doing it is to code the data so that at the end of it, the researcher will be able to extract the essence of the informant's meaning from the data that they have gathered. This diagram, which I took up from Saldana, will give us some an overview illustration of how a qualitative data analysis look like. In this diagram, you can see data. Data here is referring to the raw data. Normally, we obtain from interview, which then we transcribe into words, or maybe observation, and then we transcribe into words as well. These are typical data for qualitative research. And then researcher need to do first cycle of coding. In this first cycle of coding, the role of the researcher is to read the data and code the data into similar characteristic. And then from the data, from the code, researcher need to go through another cycle of coding, which is called second cycle of coding. The purpose of the second cycle of coding is to categorize codes into similar categories. And then finally, based on the codes and categories, researcher can come up with findings for their research. Okay, while doing the coding, researcher need to make decision on what is the best coding method they can choose. Of course, in choosing coding methods is highly depending on the research question. This book by Saldana, this book is actually on coding methods. So he suggested lots of coding methods depending on what is the research outcome that the researcher would like to contribute at the end of the research. For the purpose of this presentation, I will rely on one example of research question, which is how do managers identify performance problems among their subordinates? So therefore, for this kind of research question, according to Saldana, causation coding method is suitable because it allows the researcher to examine the way a person thinks about relationship between a cause and an outcome. Take, for example, this is the research question. How do managers identify performance problems among subordinates? Therefore, when a researcher relies on causation coding method, what it does is when the researcher code from the raw data, the researcher is try to uncover what the managers believe the reason behind employees' performance issues. Okay, so from there we can see when we do the coding, using this method, what we do, we try to put a code between a cause and an outcome. Let's look at example of how to do causation coding. In this table, you can see a sample of raw data. Okay, the raw data is basically the conversation between the interviewer and the respondent or the informant of the research. And then based on the raw data and the role of the researcher when the researcher is doing the causation coding is to pick up three interrelated codes that can explain what has caused what. Yeah, meaning code A has caused code B, and code B has caused code C. Okay, so from this example, it's about what gives signals to the employers of employees' performance. So the respondent gives some answer on what the respondent think on the signals of poor performance, and then as a researcher, we need to translate this raw data into three interrelated codes. And then from the first cycle of coding, and then we move on to the second cycle of coding. And the purpose of this second cycle of coding is to group codes, the codes that we get from the first cycle of coding. And now we're going to group them into similar categories and subcategory. And here at this point, the role of the researcher is to identify pattern. And then the way we do it is by looking at the connections between the codes and categories. Saldana suggested pattern coding because at this stage, at the second cycle of coding, if we rely on a pattern coding during our second cycle of coding, what we're doing here as a researcher is to make decision and which code will make the most analytical analytic sense to form research findings. So basically, when we're doing this, when we make decision, we need to choose, because from the first cycle of coding, we might end up with thousands of codes, and now we have to make decision out of these thousands. How do we choose the most salient categories that help us to answer our research question? So at this point is we really need to be guided by our research question, so that the codes that we have derived from the first cycle of coding, we only use this code for the purpose of categories that will help us to answer the research question. Let's consider an example of pattern coding. From here, you can see here some from the first cycle of coding. In the example that I'm using is I use causation coding method, and then we have code A, code B, code C. In this example, I have 3 respondents. So we put them in a row and column, and based on the pattern that we have, code A, code B, code C, and then we think about how are they similar to each other. Okay, so in this example, they are similar in terms of the manager's queue, because of the research objective is to look into signal that the manager received that tell the managers these are poor performance. Okay, so the categories I have is manager's queue, and then different respondent will give different queue. For example, the first respondent, Badrul, the queue that Badrul gets by when observing his employees is about work not progressing. And Delilah, according to Delilah, the manager's queue is monitoring work outcome and behavior. That's how Delilah knows that the employees are not performing. And from Chempaka, she looks into behavior as a secondary, whereas the output is the primary. So from the code that we get from the first cycle, and then we move on to the second cycle of coding, we look at similarity. So in this example, they are similar in terms of cues that managers receive that tell the managers these are poor performers. And then based on the sample of data that I have presented, and also based on the research question, I try to illustrate to you how do managers identify performance problems among their subordinates. So the finding that I derive from the codes is work output is the primary cue, while the behavior is the secondary cue. I come up with this finding based on the category, which is manager's queue, and the subcategories under manager queues, which are work not progressing, monitoring work outcome and behavior is secondary. From this finding, I can conclude that the managers identify performance problem among subordinates by firstly observing the subordinates' work output, then their behavior. After we finish doing the analysis, and then we come up with our findings and conclusion and later conclusion, a qualitative researcher need to think about the trustworthiness of their data. If you are familiar with the quantitative term of it, is the validity of the data. So in qualitative research, we check the trustworthiness of data. There are many ways, but I would like to suggest 2 of them. Number 1 is information validation, meaning we take back the preliminary analysis. Probably when we do the first cycle of coding, we took the coding to the informants and then let the informant check. And if the informant agree with the codes that we make, meaning it's a good thing. If they don't agree, they allow to change they change the written transcript, so that the analysis that we do represent what they try to tell us during the interview, for example. And another way to check for trustworthiness is by looking at data saturation. This is when we do the second cycle of coding and we realize there is no new category that emerged from the data. So that situation is called data saturation. Another thing that a qualitative researcher need to do is to check for consistency, or in quantitative research we call it reliability. Okay, in quantitative research there are many ways to do this consistency, to check the consistency of data. But in this presentation I want to suggest two techniques. Number one is audit trail. This is where the researcher need to keep a diary or a logbook to keep track of various stages of the research. For example, how data were collected, how codes were derived, and how did the researcher end up with categories and findings. And they have to jot down on how they make decision throughout this process. And the second technique is peer review technique. This is where the researcher can discuss with colleague or expert in qualitative research regarding the data analysis and tentative interpretation of the data. To conclude, in qualitative research, researchers rely on the coding process to do data analysis, and the outcome of a coding process is called codes. And these codes are the researcher translation of the data, meaning the researcher gives meaning to the data. And also it is used for the purpose of pattern searching, and this pattern will be the findings of a qualitative research. To summarize, I have a table that differentiates between the first cycle of coding and second cycle of coding. In this example, I'm showing to you, I'm using causation coding method for the first cycle of coding because it is good to infer causal belief in data. And then in the second cycle of coding, in my illustration, I illustrated pattern coding method. This method is useful to group codes from codes into categories. And these two coding methods have their own purpose. The causation coding is to identify causation's process and how codes are interrelated, to explain concept of human interactions. And then the pattern coding, the purpose of we do pattern coding is to condense codes, which possibly thousands of them, into smaller number of unit, probably from thousands into hundreds. And from that smaller unit, which is categories, and then the researcher need to make decision which category will be used to answer which research question. I hope with my illustration it will give you some idea on how to do data analysis in qualitative research. And if you have anything to ask or to comment, you can contact me via my email, suhaila423@uitm.edu.my. Thank you for your time and attention. Assalamualaikum. Bye.